Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be forgotten.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Oh, cause very charges. This is part 2 of a 2-part episode. If you want to hear about the early history of humans and their activities with petroleum and other greenhouse-producing activities, and you want to hear the major evidences for climate change listed out, listen to part 1. In this episode, we're going to talk about outcomes. Best case scenario outcomes and worst case scenario outcomes. And we're going to have an interview with a researcher and her opinion on climate change and try and wrap this up with a hopeful bow. Don't believe me? Stay tuned till the end. Part 2 of climate change.
This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero, blah, blah, blah. Climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises. Of course, we need constructive dialogue, but they've now had 30 years of blah, 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 and where has that led us? Over 50% of all our CO2 emissions have occurred since 1990. And a third since 2005. All this while the media is reporting on what the leaders say that they are going to do instead of what they are actually doing. And then not holding leaders accountable for their action, or rather inaction. And don't get me wrong, we can still do this. Change is not only possible, but urgently necessary, but not if we go on like today. They say they want solutions. But you cannot solve a crisis that you do not fully understand. You cannot balance a budget if you do not count all the numbers. And as long as we ignore equity and historic emissions, and as long as we don't include consumption of imported goods, burning of biomass, etc., and as long as clever accounting is one of the most efficient ways of reducing emissions, we won't get anywhere. A sustainability crisis, a social crisis, a crisis of inequality that dates back to colonialism and beyond. A crisis based on the idea that some people are worth more than others and therefore have the right to exploit and steal other people's land and resources. And it is very naive to believe that we can solve this crisis without confronting the roots of it. Right now, we are still very much speeding in the wrong direction. 2021 is currently projected to experience the second highest emission rise ever. Only about 2% of government recovery spendings have been allocated to clean energy measures. And according to a new report by the UN, global emissions are expected to rise by 16% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. Our leaders' intentional lack of action is a betrayal towards all present and future generations. The people in power cannot claim that they are trying, because they are clearly not, as they continue opening up brand new coal mines, oil fields, and pipelines. pretending to have ambitious climate policies while granting new oil licenses, exploring enormous future oil fields, and shamelessly congratulating themselves while still failing to come up with even the bare minimum and long overdue funding to help the most vulnerable countries deal with the impacts of the climate crisis. If this is what they consider to be climate action, then we don't want it. They invite cherry-picked young people to meetings like this to pretend that they are listening to us. But they are not. They are clearly not listening to us. And they never have. Just look at the numbers. Look at the statistics. The emissions are still rising. The science doesn't lie. We can no longer let the people in power decide what is politically possible or not. We can no longer let the people in power decide what hope is. Hope is not passive. Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is telling the truth. Hope is taking action. And hope always comes from the people.
Sea level rise. Since 1920, the sea level has risen by about 8 inches. However, the rate of it has doubled over the last few years. Every year, the rate of it melting goes up and the rate of the sea rising goes up. So on top of the 8 inches we already have, in the next 100 years, the least amount the sea will rise is about 16 inches for about 24 inches in total. So minimum, the ocean's rising about 2 feet in 100 years.
Well, and I don't know. It's like that tweet from fucking Ben Shapiro where he's like, "Oh, well, you just sell your coastal home when the water rises." It's like, to fucking who? Aquaman, you know, like
fucking right.
Fucking Waterworld. Who's gonna buy your goddamn home? Little Mermaid, like.
So let's say, for the sake of argument, that all of the water levels around the world rise by let's say 5 feet. Over the next 100 years, say 10 feet by the next 100 years, and it puts all the low-lying areas on the coast underwater, right? Which, let's say all of that happens. You think that people aren't going to just sell their homes and move?
Just one small problem. Sell their houses to who, Ben? Fucking Aquaman!
Yeah, like the 2 feet doesn't sound like much, but you're right. These coastal areas, there's going to be huge like evacuation, and where are we going to rehouse these people?
Well, and like equatorial, around, you know, the equatorial region of the planet, it'll become so unbearable and unlivable. We're going to have massive immigrations.
And just from a logistical standpoint, like that's going to cause some massive emergencies,
well,
right?
Like, what happens when, you know, Canada is faced with like 80 million climate refugees from the global south, and, you know, southern U.S. moving northward to, you know, because you can't plant nothing. There's no streams, no rivers, and Canada's like the only place that's still
everything's desert,
kind of okay, because like Canada will kind of be okay in that, you know, kind of like, I mean, yeah, we'll have mass extinctions and massive global fires, and, you know, all of the whole rising coast and the melting sea. But that's one of the other things is, I mean, not to support this, but that opens up that north too. And I mean, I'm not supporting it or advocating for that or anything like that, but that is one of the climate realities that we are going to have to face, is that Canada's going to have to house a lot of fucking people, you know, in the next, 100 or so years.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to come up with like different agricultural practices to do it, because we're going to have a lot of people, and we're just going to have completely different weather from what we have or what we've become accustomed to, you know?
100%. It's going to be a radically different world.
Look at somewhere like the Netherlands too. 26% of the Netherlands is below sea level. Half of it overall is between 1 meter and sea level. And then 59% of the rest of it is vulnerable to flooding. So, like, you know, if it goes a couple feet above the dikes, like, you lose half of an entire large country in Europe.
Yep.
And that's kind of the thing. It's like the scale of this problem. like we can't really engineer ourselves out of this given the scale of this problem, you know?
Yeah.
Like a lot of people are kind of hoping for some amazing tech, you know, like Elon Musk saying, you know, if you come up with this carbon technology, well, you know, we'll invest billions of dollars. It's like, they're fucking called trees, man. Like,
yeah.
And the hell? Like, are you like these dense billionaire, you know, people who just happen to have the good engineers working for them? You can't figure out a fucking tree?
Yeah. And like there's a few things that just can't be reverse engineered. Like the sea levels rising, that's coming from ice on the land melting. That's coming from like Antarctica and Greenland and major glaciers like melting and releasing their fresh water into the ocean. Like, are we going to pump the water back onto the land and refreeze it? I don't think so.
It was about 2 years after Hurricane Katrina that I first saw the Louisiana flood maps. These flood maps are used to show land loss in the past and land loss that is to come. On this particular day, at a community meeting, these maps were used to explain how a 30-foot tidal surge that accompanied Hurricane Katrina could flood communities like mine in South Louisiana and communities across the Mississippi and Alabama coast. It turns out that the land we were losing was our buffer from the sea. I volunteered to interact with the graphics on the wall, and in an instant, my life changed for the second time in 2 years. The graphics showed massive land loss in South Louisiana and an encroaching sea. But more specifically, the graphics showed the disappearance of my community and many other communities before the end of the century. I wasn't alone at the front of the room. I was standing there with other members of South Louisiana's communities, Black, Native, poor. We thought we were just bound by temporary disaster recovery, but we found that we were now bound by the impossible task of ensuring that our communities would not be erased by sea level rise due to climate change. Friends, neighbors, family, my community, I just assumed it would always be there. Land, trees, marsh, bayous. I just assumed that it would be there as it had been for thousands of years. I was wrong. To understand what was happening to my community, I had to talk to other communities around the globe. I started in South Louisiana with the United Homa Nation. I talked to youth advocates in Shishmaref, Alaska. I talked to fisherwomen in coastal Vietnam, justice fighters in Fiji, new generations of leaders in the ancient cultures of the Torres Straits. Communities that had been here for thousands of years were suffering the same fate, and we were all contemplating how we would survive the next 50. By the end of the next century, it's predicted that more than 180 million people will be displaced due to climate change. And in South Louisiana, those who can afford to do so are already moving. They're moving because South Louisiana is losing land at one of the fastest rates on the planet. Disappearance is what my Bayou community has in common with other coastal communities. Erasure is what communities around the globe are fighting as we get real about the impacts of climate change.
And like we've seen the amount of abuse and genocide and shit that's happened with like other types of refugees coming in. Like this is going to open up the door for all kinds of like trauma and like tragedy to happen.
Well, and they're planning for it. Like that's why I think there's like been suddenly a massive push of like eco-fascism in the right and that sort of thing, because it's like suddenly my homeland is going to be filled with these invaders, and now we gotta control the environment and too much population and kill off the people. Like those are lines coming out of the fucking eco-fascist right here. That whole when COVID happened and then people shut down and the earth started to do things, whales started coming back to places they hadn't been for decades. All that shit started happening and people were like, humans are the virus. No, that's all fucking eco-fascism shit. Like, no, we're enough of that. But yeah, that's the reality though, is they're trying to organize because this is what's coming down the pipe, and they want to be able to resist it and lock people out and have this, ethnic homeland that they fantasize so hard about. We can't. We have to prepare ourselves to accept people from all walks of life who are climate refugees from everywhere.
Yeah. And especially because, in large part, the industry and the capitalism of the Western world are the forces that drove them out of their homes, that did the lion's share of, heating up the earth. It's our fault. We should take care of the problem we mostly caused. Fuck. But, you're right. Fascists will use any excuse they need to try and get rid of the people they don't deem worthy of living in their spaces or living in general. And one of the excuses that fascists will use is environmental excuses. So they'll say, well, I'm really concerned about the planet, so that's why we should deport everyone I don't like and lead a mass genocide. It's just another justification for their bullshit views, but this time they're using global warming as the reasoning for their evils.
I think the only thing scarier than a far-right racist movement that denies the reality of climate change is a far-right racist movement that doesn't deny the reality of climate change, that actually says this is happening, there are going to be many millions of people on the move, and we are going to use this abhorrent ideology that ranks the relative value of human life, that puts white Christians at the top of the hierarchy, that animalizes and otherizes everyone else, as the justification for allowing those people to die. And so, that is the significance of what happened in New Zealand, because I think it was the first time one of these attackers self-identified as eco-fascist. It's not the first time that climate change has been evoked by one of these killers. It was evoked by the Norwegian killer, Anders Breivik, who talked about how climate debt was one of the things he was upset about. He saw it as a conspiracy to redistribute the wealth of Europe and North America to the global South, because they understand that if climate change is real, it does require a redistribution of resources. And this is fundamentally at the heart of where we're at right now. We're at a crossroads where, it's not about who denies it anymore. I think that within a few years, climate change denial as a force is going to have disappeared. The question is, in the face of this crisis, are we going to, we in the wealthy world, hoard what is left, lock out everybody else, see this resurgence in these abhorrent ideologies that never went away, and are we just going to take care of our own, as they say, or are we going to recognize that our fates are interconnected? Are we going to completely reimagine borders, and are we going to share what's left? We are all inside the climate. Whatever issue it is that we are focused on, it is within the context of a habitable planet that we need to protect.
The sad thing about the report that came out this year, the 2021 IPCC report, is it didn't really say anything new. The report that it released previously set out this scenario where it basically said it might be too late. And then in 2021, they set out a memo that said, if we want to avoid all climate change whatsoever, it is too late. If we do everything we can, everything within humanity's power to fight this, we can limit climate change to about 2 degrees Celsius above the Industrial Revolution normals. What is everything we can? We pivot away from fossil fuels completely. We stop using them. We change our entire global energy production to sustainable, renewable energy. And that is not an easy task. A lot of people make it sound as easy as hooking up solar panels, but electric grids are complicated. You have to have, standing power to keep them electrified at all times, and sometimes certain forms of renewable energies don't have that. And some renewable energies have an upper threshold of energy they can capture that might not meet the limit that humanity needs. So it's a complicated question, but still we have to transfer our entire energy structure over. We have to solve that problem successfully.
Well, the interesting thing is that over the last several hundred years, human beings have actually been trying to move away from what you would consider matter-dense fuels towards energy-dense ones. And that means really from wood and dung towards coal, oil, natural gas, uranium. This is a phenomenon that's been going on for a long time. Poor countries around the world are in the process still of moving away from wood and dung as their primary energies. And for the most part, this is a positive thing. As you stop using wood as your major source of fuel, it allows the forests to grow back and the wildlife to return. As you stop burning wood in your home, you no longer need to breathe that toxic smoke. And as you go from coal to natural gas and uranium as your main sources of energy, it holds out the possibility of basically eliminating air pollution altogether. There's just this problem with nuclear. While it's been pretty popular to move from dirtier to cleaner energy sources, from energy diffuse to energy dense sources, nuclear is just really unpopular for a bunch of historical reasons. And as a consequence, in the past, and I think a lot of others have sort of said, well, in order to deal with climate change, we're just going to need all the different kinds of clean energy that we have. The problem is that just turns out not to be true. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear. If France were to try to significantly scale up solar and wind, it would also have to significantly reduce how much electricity it gets from nuclear. That's because in order to handle the huge variability of solar and wind on the grid, they would need to burn more natural gas. Think of it this way, it's just really hard to ramp up and down a nuclear plant, whereas I think we're all pretty familiar with turning the natural gas up and down on our stove. A similar process works in managing the grid. Of course, it goes without saying that oil and gas companies understand this pretty well, which is why we've seen them invest millions of dollars in recent years in promoting solar and wind. This just raises, I think, another challenging question, which is that in places that are using a lot of nuclear, have grids that are mostly nuclear and hydro, going towards solar and wind and other renewables would actually increase carbon emissions.
We have to come up with an alternative to concrete production and all productions that produce greenhouse gases. We come up with a new way to produce plastic, because plastic is a petroleum product. We shut down mass meat production and high CO2 producing agriculture. We become extremely practiced in not wasting food. We find an alternative to wood and replenish the world's forests. We get better at recycling. We actually get mass corporations to listen to restrictions. No cheating. Actually, they have to listen. The entire earth, every country, every government and corporation has to work together. This will likely involve us bribing countries in order to get them to play along. The Western world may go bankrupt from the amount of money we have to invest in this, from the amount of countries we have to bribe to play along. But that's what we have to do in order to get the entire planet.
Like reparations in a way. Because like the Western world has, exploited, Latin America, South America, Africa, like they've extracted all sorts of resources, and so that we can live this like lifestyle, this really wealthy lifestyle, comparatively speaking, from others, and it's kind of like, and then when the climate hits, it's not going to be us anyway who's going to affect, as a result of our existence. It's like I said, the southern countries, and now. I don't know. I guess to have to invest that money, to me, it just seems like we should be the ones investing that money because we're the ones who extracted that wealth from everyone else on the planet already.
Oh, I'm right with you. I'm right with you there. Like we've lived high on the hog for a couple hundred years, exploiting most of the world so that the Western world can have a better quality of life. It seems sort of fair, especially since we're pushing the planet over the cliff, I agree. Even if we end up bankrupting the Western world, even if our quality of life drops, we need everyone to contribute to have a big shot at solving this. In order to get this best case scenario, humanity would have to cooperate fully and participate fully in a planet-wide group work project where every human does their part.
It's never fucking going to happen.
I don't know. I'm optimistic in the sense that I think we can stop things before we annihilate all life on the planet. And in fact, I think I'm optimistic that we'll stop things before we annihilate all human life on the planet. So I think I'm being optimistic because I think when shit hits the fan, we can organize. We can get our shit together. This whole COVID thing, the world basically shut down, and everything just stopped so that we could get masks up and get ventilators ready and get, for the inevitable race. We can cooperate when shit gets
we have the
bad.
capacity.
And I think we can do this. Like, I think we can do this on the global scale. And like you said, we may have to bribe some countries to play along. But I mean, what are those? Like tariffs, we call them in the real world, or like in foreign policy. It's like different countries enact different regulations to extract money from other countries. It's what they do.
Yeah. I'm an endless optimist. I want to believe that we'll find a way through and that we'll pull together.
But it is a simple fact. The main driver of global warming is human action. How much carbon we put into the atmosphere. Our hands are on those levers. And we can write the story of the planet's climate future ourselves. Not just can, but are. Since inaction is a kind of action, we'll be writing that story ourselves whether we like it or not. This is not just any story. All of us holding the future of the planet in our hands. It's the kind of story we used to recognize only in mythology and theology. A single generation that has brought the future of humanity into doubt, now tasked with securing a new future. So what would that look like? It could mean solar arrays barnacling the planet, really everywhere you looked. It could mean if we developed battery technology, we wouldn't even need to deploy them that broadly, because it's been estimated that just a sliver of the Sahara Desert absorbs enough solar power to provide all the world's energy needs. But we'd probably need a new electric grid, one that doesn't lose 2/3 of its power to waste heat, as is today the case in the US. We couldn't use some more nuclear power, perhaps, although it would have to be an entirely different kind of nuclear power, because today's technology simply isn't cost competitive with renewable energy, whose costs are falling so rapidly. We need a new kind of plane, because I don't think it's particularly practical to ask the entire world to give up on air travel, especially as so much of the global south is, for the very first time, able to afford it. We need planes that won't produce carbon. We need a new kind of agriculture, because we probably can't ask people to entirely give up on meat and go vegan. It would mean a new way of raising beef, or perhaps an old way, since we already know that traditional pasturing practices can turn cattle farms from what are called carbon sources, which produce CO2, into carbon sinks, which absorb them. If you prefer a techno solution, maybe we can grow some of that meat in a lab. Probably we could also feed some real cattle seaweed, because that cuts their methane emissions by as much as 95 or 99%. Probably we'd have to do all of these things, because as with every aspect of this puzzle, the problem is simply too vast and complicated to solve in any single silver bullet way. And no matter how many solutions we deploy, we probably won't be able to decarbonize in time. That's the terrifying math that we face. We won't be able to beat climate change, only live with it and limit it. And that means we'd probably need some amount of what are called negative emissions, which take carbon out of the atmosphere as well. Billions of new trees, maybe trillions of new trees, and whole plantations of carbon capture machines. Perhaps an industry twice or 4 times the size of today's oil and gas business to undo the damage that was done by those businesses in past decades. We would need a new kind of infrastructure poured by a different kind of cement, because today, if cement were a country, it would be the world's 3rd biggest emitter. And China's pouring as much cement every 3 years as the US poured in the entire 20th century. We would need to build seawalls and levees to protect those people living on the coast, many of whom are too poor to build them today, which is why it must mean an end to a narrowly nationalistic geopolitics that allows us to define the suffering of those living elsewhere in the world
as insignificant when we even acknowledge it. This better future won't be easy. But the only obstacles are human ones. That may not be much of a comfort if you know what I know about human brutality and indifference, but I promise you it is better than the alternative. Science isn't stopping us from taking action, and neither is technology. We have the tools we need today to begin.
So this is if we throw everything at the wall, everybody's cooperating. This is what's going to happen if all those things I set out before happens. We're still going to hit about 2 degrees Celsius above normal levels by 2100. Heat extremes would reach more critical thresholds for agriculture and health. Basically, that means that climate change would intensify the water cycle. This would bring more intense rainfalls, flooding, and drought across the planet. Areas that were once fertile will turn into deserts, and vice versa. The climate will change, ecosystems will change, and the farmlands humanity has had for centuries will start to shift and change. We won't be able to rely on areas we thought were fertile before because they'll become not fertile anymore. They won't be able to support farming. Coastal areas will continue to see sea level rises throughout the 21st century, contributing to frequent and severe coastal flooding in low-lying areas. So if we keep it to 2 degrees above Celsius, we would see about 200 million climate change refugees which is still a fuckload of people, but it's better than 1.4 billion.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Extreme events would become more numerous, though, by 2100. Right now, in our current age, we're having about 4 times more climate disasters. That's hurricanes, that's forest fires, that's extreme heat waves, extreme droughts, floods. All those things are occurring about 4 times more regularly than at the start of the Industrial Revolution. By 2100, with us reaching 2 degrees above normal, those same events will occur about 9 times as often. So we're still looking at, from current levels, climate disasters happening almost a little more than double as much as they're happening now. Still, the coast will flood. There will be a severe increase in weather events. Like I said, about 200 million people will be displaced, need a new home. We've seen in the past where a mass migration of people has led to abuse and genocide and great evils being occurred. People will likely die to find a new home after their old ones become uninhabitable. But if we do it right, maybe we'll be able to settle like a good group of people. Like maybe you're right. Maybe humanity will be able to help settle this mass of new people. For the cities, some aspects of climate change may be amplified, especially heat. So thousands of cities right now that are built will be in areas that will be too hot to have human survival. Like going outside for an extended period of time would be like fatal to somebody who has complications. So even though our power systems would be stressed, we would have to find more power to basically pump out and cool trillions of more BTUs of heat. So would have to be removed from homes, and that costs a lot more energy. Further warming will amplify permafrost thawing. It'll melt about 10% of the thermofrost past what we have now, but it won't push it over the edge where most of it gets defrosted and like an unprecedented amount of greenhouse gas will be released. That's the big red evil button we're trying to avoid. Or I guess one of them is the permafrost melting and all that greenhouse gas is being released.
Not so perma, am I right?
Yep.
Yuck, 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 yuck.
Yeah. Changes to the ocean, including warming, more frequent marine heat waves, ocean acidification, and reduced oxygen levels, will devastate ocean life. So even with it only going 2 degrees above, in 100 years by 2100, about 10% of the coral reefs that are alive today will survive. The ocean will have about 15% of the biodiversity it has now, and with 2 degrees above, if we hold it at 2 degrees and perhaps even make it go back down, about 20% of glaciers and land ice would remain frozen. Animal, plants, and fish will experience frequent extinctions, as many species will not be able to adapt to changing conditions. Food and water shortages would cause resources to be controlled, so humanity would probably have to ration bread and water. And also the biodiversity, the oceans breaking down and all those animals going extinct will cause a collapse of many different food webs and cause like a loss of biodiversity across the planet. The breakdown of reliable farming will further add to food problems, and many will not be able to eat. We will have millions starve and tens of millions be underfed. That's if we do everything we can with current technology. That doesn't take into account new technology, that doesn't take into account technology that could reverse things or take things out. That's our scenario as it stands now, with our best case scenario.
When we talk about worst case scenarios, there are a couple of different factors at play. One is what humans do. This is the most important factor. Will we change course? Will we continue to burn coal? Will we continue to produce fossil fuel emissions? The UN says that the track we're on now, the trajectory we're on now, is likely to take us to about 4.3 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century if we don't change course. 4.3 degrees would mean $600 trillion in global climate damages. That's double all the wealth that exists in the world today. It would mean parts of the world could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. It would mean more than double the warfare that we see today. And the impacts would be in our economic activity, it would be in flooding and the refugee crisis. There are so many impacts that we have not really been able to think clearly about because all of us are so reluctant to consider these horrifying outcomes. But the fact that they are horrifying should not make us turn away. It should make us focus on them more intently. We all have all of these psychological reflexes that make us reluctant to consider horrible possibilities. And for that reason, it's more important for us to take seriously the science because we need to fight against those impulses, to do better planning, to take more aggressive action than we would if we allowed ourselves to slip back into complacency. But there are cases that are worse than 4.3 degrees. There are what are called feedback loops in the climate system that could conceivably accelerate warming beyond what human action does. So there's what's called the albedo effect. Sunlight is reflected back into outer space by any surface that's white. That's why when you wear a white shirt, you're cooler than if you wear a black shirt in the summer. The less Arctic ice there is, the less reflective white ice there is at the top of the planet. That means more sunlight is being absorbed, which means that more warming would take place. So as Arctic ice melts, the planet's ability to reflect solar energy back into space would diminish and warming would accelerate. There is frozen in the Arctic permafrost a lot of methane, or a lot of carbon, which could be released into the atmosphere as methane if that permafrost melts. Methane is, depending on how you count, at least 30 and perhaps 80 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. And there is enough carbon in that permafrost to double the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere that we have today. If that were released, it could accelerate warming by a couple of degrees all on its own. There are many more feedback loops like this. Just this past week, there was a study about cloud formation. If we get to about 1,200 parts per million of carbon, which is much higher than we are today at about 410, but is conceivable early next century, we would completely disrupt the planet system for cloud formation. And that impact alone, scientists say in this study, would add 8 degrees Celsius of warming to the system. So we'd probably be at already 4.5 or 5 degrees by then, and we could immediately be brought to 12.5 or 13 degrees Celsius. And that really would make much of the planet literally uninhabitable. Not just the equatorial band, not just the tropics, but there'd be places in the mid-latitudes that would just be too hot to live. And we have not really begun to think about those possibilities. This is the world that we're entering into now at just 1.1 degrees, but the whole range of possibilities stretches before us. And even the quite optimistic outcomes are horrifying. 2 degrees is genocide, the island nations of the world say. 4 degrees is at least twice as bad, depending on how you count. And there are possibilities north of 4 degrees, which are even scarier because it would mean that the climate system had escaped human control.
What I'm about to read you is the worst version of that. This is more of a worst case scenario. And what I mean by worst case scenario, as I'm defining it, is we release about the amount of emissions that we're releasing now until the year 2100. Things don't really change for us. By that time, we would be about 5 degrees above pre-industrial limits. as opposed to 2 degrees with the best case scenario. This is the human-caused worst case scenario. And this doesn't even take into account the natural processes that we may set in motion by pushing climate change too far. China says they will go carbon neutral by 2060. America says they will go carbon neutral by 2035, and many other countries have put their dates between those two, but it won't be enough for this worst case scenario. By 2050, the situation that I laid out in our best case scenario would have already occurred. By 2050, we may be 2 degrees above pre-industrial limits, and by 2100, we are sitting around 5 degrees above pre-industrial limits. The fertile lands that humanity has used for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, that have fed cities generation after generation, will cease to be fertile. Global weather will turn fertile land into deserts, deserts into forests, and forests into tundras, and humanity will likely not be able to adapt and move the infrastructure in time to fight the oncoming starvation that will follow. Rising temperatures will cause fresh water sources to evaporate, meaning we'll have less to put on our crops because we'll need to ration it just for human consumption. Our industrial infrastructure would break down. Once we're rationing fresh water just to keep humans alive, we can't manufacture things so well anymore. Almost every single product and manufacturing process has water involved at some stage, and we would lose access to so much of that to ration water to keep humans alive. In this worst case scenario, the glaciers and the land ice would have been gone by 2050, and by 2100, they are a distant memory. Florida, New York, California, along with large swaths, millions of square miles, would be underwater. Even if you build seawalls and water pumps, the cost to maintain those systems would overwhelm budgets almost immediately. These places that humanity has settled in for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years would suddenly become uninhabitable. Now, we talked about the devastation that a couple feet of sea level rise could wrought in our likely best case scenario. Estimates vary, but there about 200 million people would be displaced. But in our worst case scenario, where we keep on doing what we've always done and we drive climate change into a warm corner, we could see sea level rise as high as 8 feet, displacing over 1 billion people on Earth. Next time you're at a lake, or a river, or an ocean, or a body of water, imagine that water being 8 feet higher, and look at all the things in your vicinity that would be consumed. Repeat that the world over. Which countries would this affect? Oh, you know, just a few. Japan, Egypt, Brazil, China, Germany, Turkey, France, Italy, the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Haiti, Nigeria, Yemen, America, the Fiji Islands, Samoa, the Marshall Islands. All these places will have their populations displaced. No country will be untouched. In this worst case scenario, every country will be likely driven to extremes. Natural disasters will be bigger in size individually and will occur more often. As the ocean warms, and as we've stated before, several billion nuclear bombs worth of energy is pumped into the oceans, All that energy has to go somewhere, and it can be used by processes such as weather and hurricane formation to produce devastating storms. And it's not just hurricanes, it's forest fires, it's gales, it's regular storms that flood an area. These bigger and more powerful natural disasters will move at a faster pace, go farther inland, and last longer. Remember when I said that we're going to have an increase to about 9 times the regular amount of natural disasters compared to pre-industrial levels? In the best case scenario? In this scenario, we may have 36 times as many natural disasters as we would if we didn't put all these emissions in the air. And all these storms would be more powerful. Imagine if you live anywhere near the coast, or even if you don't, record-breaking natural disasters occurring multiple times a year. Maybe you live in an area that has foliage to burn. Maybe you live near the coast. Imagine a world record-breaking hurricane or forest fire happening in January. And then another new world record-breaking natural disaster happening in March, and several other times that year, and that's just your life now. Between fertile land going dry, more frequent and more powerful natural disasters, sea levels rising and displacing people, and the biodiversity of the planet shutting down and producing food and water shortages, this will produce about 1.2 billion climate change refugees that will try and flock to the habitable areas of the world, as they should. If you were driven out of your home by climate change, and you needed to find a place for you and your family to live, you would head for greener pastures too. These people are doing what we would all do. They're fighting to survive, and they deserve to do it. But unfortunately, this desperation will likely be met with tragedy and violence and all the manner of things that humans do when refugees enter an area. Concentration camps, genocides, cultural demonization and discrimination, marginalization, and probably as a result, lots of slavery, murder, starvation, abuse, trauma, and death will occur, with all those refugees fleeing the climate change crisis and its results. The coral reefs would be long dead. They would have been fully bleached and devoid of life permanently year-round by 2080. And the oceans would soon follow. The acidification of the ocean would be amplified. The oceans getting hotter would take oxygen out of them, which means fish would not be able to draw the oxygen they need to live out of the water as readily. And in the worst case scenario, if we're 5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, the biodiversity of the ocean would be about 0.5% of what it is today. That means we would lose 99.5% of all life in the oceans. And it's not going to just isolate itself to the oceans. The Earth isn't a closed box of ecosystems. The life cycles of these animals all connect. You think you can lose 99.5% of all ocean life and food chains around the world wouldn't break down? This will cause a chain reaction that will cause another extinction event. And extinction events in the past have occurred over long periods of time, gradually. But in this climate change worst-case scenario, it seems that us little humans would have driven the planet to the edge of extinction in just a few short 100 years. This will further devastate humanity. We will be rationing food and water, unable to farm and collect enough water to even farm. Food chains will collapse and humans will be driven to fight one another. A mass extinction of life on Earth will occur, and humans might be on that list. And remember, in these scenarios, I'm only counting up to the year 2100. We want to last longer than that, don't we? And even if we don't, we will. the temperatures aren't going to stop rising on the year 2100. They're going to keep on going up and up and up and up unless we do something. And these effects will go into overdrive, and the natural processes that release even more methane and even more greenhouse gases may take hold. We need to put the brakes on this immediately. This is a runaway train. And like I said in the beginning, we're all in a runaway train, and we're also all tied to the train tracks. This is a trolley problem with all of the human population involved. When confronted with this information, a lot of people seem to resign themselves to the fate that's before us, that, oh, we're fucked, like, let's just doomer this whole thing, let's just live life while we can and fuck the future of the planet. But I don't think that's the right approach. Like, there's been lots of situations throughout history where people have been put against impossible odds and have persevered. And I think we just need to remain vigilant. We need to remain mad. We can't just, like, go quiet into that good night. We have to save the planet. Like, it's not just about us. It's about every species we have on here. It's about every person out there. We did this. We created this problem, and we have to solve it. And it looks bleak. Like, when I was reading that Bo Burnham quote, like, the world's already over, like, so you might as well give up. Like, it sung to me because it seems that dire, but I think we need to remain vigilant. We need to remain hopeful. We need to remain optimistic that, you know, we're crafty and we're clever. And I think in the end, a lot of people are still good on the inside. I think we can adapt and overcome, even presented with all this information, even as dire as it seems. I know that's my measure of it. Like, as usual, at the end of the day, I'm still an optimist. I still think we're going to find some way in the end to make it. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of us are going to be alive to see how it turns out, you know? We're going to live long enough to at least see which direction things are going, you know?
Not me and Richard, we're old.
We're old, yeah.
I'm going to get my robot legs, then I'm going to live to be 300, you wait. I don't know, what are your guys' thoughts on this after I give my giant spiel on the best case and what I think, like, the worst case scenario is going to be?
I think big, huge-ass polluting companies need to stop doing that, so you can stop guilting me about killing sea turtles with plastic straws.
Yeah, that's the other thing, like, these big petroleum companies and other companies that benefit from making the climate worse, burning fossil fuels and them selling fossil fuels benefits them, so they want to keep on doing it. A lot of them want to pass off blame to citizens, saying like, oh, you don't reduce, reuse, and recycle, like it's your fault. But I read right at the beginning, 70% of all emissions can be tracked down to 100 companies.
Yeah.
Directly.
Fuck those companies.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, there could be potential for a justice of some sort to be brought to these companies.
The guillotine!
Yeah, or, you know, we just tax the fuck out of them so that...
Or that.
We can take that money and plant the trees and do what we got to do and put what we can into R&D so that we don't, you know... Well, we can't engineer ourselves out of this problem because it's so massive. Yeah. But, you know, incandescent light versus LED light, you know, you've kind of got, there's things that can be done. There's programs that can be put into place. A lot of home retrofits could be done to help save energy. And these fucking, you know, what is it? The 100 companies doing the 70% emitting, you know, we could use them. We can, you know, take their money and then take it and use it to invest in low flow shower heads to conserve water and, you know, all sorts of things like that to just bring everything up, because there's a lot of stuff that we can do that doesn't, you know, it just requires money.
Well, yeah, fuck capitalism for making it too expensive for me to have low flow showers.
Well, exactly. And you know, tankless hot water heaters that aren't burning natural gas all the time. You know, like there's so many things we can be doing to with today's technology to make things better, and all you got to do is have the money so that it can get done.
Yeah.
I'm not completely based and black-pilled on this or anything. Like, I'm not convinced that the humanity as a whole is screwed, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of things we can do, and there's a lot of things standing in our way.
Mhm.
I feel like nuclear energy has a massive part to play in this.
Mhm.
Like, everything is going to get worse.
Yep.
There is a risk that we need to take by using nuclear power
Mhm.
to supplement our renewables.
Mhm.
So that being said, they need to be somewhere it's not going to get ripped down by a hurricane.
Yeah. Or else we'll have Japan over again, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of things we can do.
Yeah.
There's a lot of drastic measures to take and to consider.
Yeah.
But I believe that we can do it.
Yeah.
Long story short, TLDR, the next 500 years is going to suck no matter what we do. We might as well make it suck a little less.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And, if we can responsibly ride out this storm, like, if we can actually pull this off and come together and save the planet, like, maybe my little dream of a happy little Doctor Who future where we touch the stars and explore the universe as, like, little perceivers of reality, like, that makes me, like, that makes me feel good that, like, maybe we are worth a damn. Maybe we aren't just, like, this plague-like influence on the Earth. Maybe the fact that we're here and we're observing and we're learning and we're here together, like, fighting this together, maybe it's a good thing in the end. And, like, I'd like to think that. And I think climate change is going to be the big test to see, like, can we pull together? Can humanity come together for the good of us all?
I was really impressed with humanity for about the first 6-7 months of COVID.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
500 years.
Yeah. Maybe I'll be a pessimist when I'm 90, but I'm still living out hope for now. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Hang on to that. Once you get this age, it's a little different.
I mean, it's inevitable. We're fucked, but we, like you said, we can be less fucked. And, instead of it being, 5 degrees, maybe we can cut it off at 2.
Yeah.
And yes, we're going to lose lots of life forms, and we're going to have to restructure how we do things with our society and the people around us. We're going to have to take in a lot more and consume a lot less. But I think we will do that.
Yeah.
I think we will be able to kind of rein it in at that point.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can force the 70 or so companies that have known about the greenhouse gases since, the 1970s and then covered it up. And, hopefully we can, get some help out of them to make things better, in one way or another.
I mean, crimes against humanity as a thing is crimes against nature.
I hope so.
Yeah. I don't know.
I think in a just society it should be. So just to round off our discussion, I am collabing with somebody I've collabed in the past that I feel has a great amount of professional know-how to bring to this discussion. Would you like to introduce yourself, pretty please?
Yes, so my name is Anastasia Shavrova. I am a PhD candidate at this time at UNSW in Sydney, Australia.
Excellent. And I hear that you've done a couple pieces of research in relation to climate change, primarily research dealing with frog mating cycles, but some to do with bird migration and their interaction with wind turbines.
Yeah, that's correct. I did several bouts of research with frog mating and frog mating calls, as well as I actually worked in the industry for an engineering company where I did the research with the wind turbines. But I used to work for an environmental consulting company. And what I did was I looked at how wind turbines affect animals, right? Because that's the whole stigma where it's like, we don't want wind turbines because they will kill all the birds and the bats and, anything that flies, they will kill it.
I know birds have tiny brains, but they can probably avoid something like that.
For goodness sakes, they have eyes.
Right? I mean, they're not just like little drones that if you don't turn the joystick, they're going to get chopped up, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So that was the whole, that's the propaganda of those coal companies being like, did you, we thought you cared about the animals. Why are you killing them with wind turbines? And it's like, wow. So if any accidents do occur, they are in the smallest numbers. And when they do occur, it's mostly with bats than it is with birds. And that's because bats use echolocation. and they can't judge how quickly the wind turbine is spinning. So when they use their echolocation, it looks like an empty spot, and then when they continue flying, they'll get hit by a wind turbine. I'm no engineer, so maybe a solution could be found. But even then, yes, the bats were every now and again harmed, but they were in such tiny numbers. And the research that I did was on a migratory island where it was a biodiversity hotspot.
So
and
theoretically, worst case scenario.
Exactly. Worst case scenario, migratory island, biological hotspot, breeding season. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, those wind turbines did not murder all of the birds and bats on that island. They were thriving. And if it did occur, it was very upsetting, but it was nothing close to the numbers that coal companies will do, or oil rigging, or any like that, or burning the goddamn Amazon for your cows and your pigs and stuff. Not even close to those numbers. And so then sometimes I'm doing my research and locals will come to talk, and some locals were really against these wind turbines. Guess why they didn't like the wind turbines?
I don't know. I've seen some clips on YouTube that it gave them imaginary headaches because it produced like an EMP field from the spinning blades, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I worked right underneath the wind turbines. Never got a headache. I literally would stand. I would do transects around those goddamn wind turbines. Not a problem. I can tell you now, never got a headache from that for sure. Any other guesses?
They couldn't fly kites?
That's an excellent one. It's because they thought they looked ugly.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Can
you believe that shit? Yeah. Because they thought they looked ugly. And I'm like, really? Because you go to goddamn Holland just to look at the fucking wind turbines. Like, you buy postcards from Holland just littered, I guess in their words, with wind turbines. Why, if you think they're so goddamn ugly?
Yeah. Tiny wooden grinding rice? Okay. Giant producing electricity made of metal? No, suddenly it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't a lot of people. It was just and I think it was the people who spoke to me the most, because obviously they know I'm doing something there, and they would give them glares, and there would be like protests in the area, but being like, get rid of the wind turbines, they look ugly, they're ruining our land and stuff. And the thing was, the wind turbines where they was actually other people's private lands. So other people who lived on that biological hotspot, they're like, hey, George down the street who doesn't like my wind turbine, get the fuck out, because it's on my land and I can do whatever the hell I want with my land, and so that's how those wind turbines were still kept. And no matter how much you protest, a person could do whatever the hell they want with their land. And frankly, you can't hear the wind turbine. And I don't know, I never thought that they were ugly. Again, people go to Holland to fucking look at them. So these people, they speak with such confidence when a quick Google search and Wikipedia can right away rebuttal your own point of like, birds will melt as they fly by. It's I don't know where I guess it's maybe word of mouth, and then you just don't want to explore, like, critical think, I guess. That's what a lot of people are missing these days is critical thinking skills, and forming your own opinion.
And something I've realized again and again, stuff that makes like gut logic like seems to have internal sense. Like, even if it's not really true, people will go along with it. Like, and the best example I've seen of that is like when the politician comes into like a floor of some political cabinet, or like meeting somewhere with a snowball, and he says, climate change, look at it, snowing outside, and it's October, what's this climate change you're talking about, hee. And like the internal logic, like, sure, if the earth was warming, why is it snowing in October? But like when you look at the macro, like the earth is warming on average, so that's just a moot point. But it makes enough
Yeah.
like gut logic that like most people are like, yeah, that sounds, yeah, global warming's a hoax because snowball.
Of national attention, and in case we have forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record, I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball, and that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
Exactly. Like I just watched a TikTok compilation of somebody going onto people's live streams and just asking them like, do you believe in climate change? And it's just all of these people. Many of the people went, well, it snows in the wintertime and it's rains in the spring and it's hot in the summertime. So no. And I'm like, good job, buddy. You just explained the weather. Like, what? You know, and then they'll look outside my window, like especially now in November. Look outside my window, it's snowing. I'm like, again, the goddamn weather. You know, good on you. You can look up at the sky. That's not, people don't understand the difference between climate and weather. And that's why I think people get so, well, when they make their arguments, a lot of the time their arguments is just weather. It's the peaks that are getting, you know, much more drastic. But in Canada, if it gets more cold, you put on a bigger jacket. In Australia, when the peak gets more hot, we can't go outside. Like, we have hit record temperatures here. We're talking, and I live in Sydney, right, where we're by the ocean, there's some breeze. I don't even want to know how people live in, you know, the North, not Northern Territory, sorry, but the North Territories, or even central New South Wales. Like, those people can't live there at specific times of the month because it's impossible. You will cook to death. You can't, you know? And it's so frustrating that people from, you know, who have never, say, been to a tropical country or Australia or anywhere other than, you know, Northern America or, say, Northern Europe, where like, they don't understand that hot doesn't mean we get to go to the beach more. Hot means old people are dying because some places in Europe never had air conditioning because they were never prepared for this kind of climate. Children can't go outside. Children can't have recess during the summertime because it is too hot here. Imagine 50 degrees Celsius. It feels like an oven when you go outside. It's disgusting.
Yeah, you can slow cook an egg at that temperature.
Exactly. And, you know, it's not a funny thing. People are literally dying of heat exhaustion in countries where it's not prepared to go through this kind of, you know, I say it's a few degrees, but these few degrees have significant dramatic changes to how we humans can't even adapt to this kind of weather. Through evolution, and no human has had to live in 50 degrees Celsius of hot climate, you know?
Yeah, we're not bacteria in petri dishes. You know, we take about 20 years to produce a new generation. We're not going to adapt fast enough, people.
Exactly. And so whenever people are just like, well, look, it's snowing and oh, it's too cold for me, let's just put on a jacket. I'm like, yeah, you know what? Come to Australia, peak summer. Let's see I'll let you leave the house, because for us, like living in Sydney, we just stay inside. We cannot go outside. We can't breathe because I'm not even exaggerating. It's an oven. You cannot breathe. Like, stick your head into the oven and see, you know, how much air you can try and gasp out. Like, oh my God, it's awful. And I hate winter. I hate winter. You know, I love hot weather. I thrive in hot weather, but I don't thrive in, you know, being cooked.
That's something I try to make clear in like our episode on climate change. Is like, a lot of people, like, their rebuttal is like, how could all us little humans like do all this? But like, in terms of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, like, if the race to catastrophic climate change is like a 100-yard dash, we started real close to the finish line. Like, we started 2 degrees away from the tipping point, and, like, since the Industrial Revolution, we've climbed a lot of the way there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And, how you were saying, like, that just researching climate change was quite depressing for you.
Oh, yeah.
As a scientist, it's quite depressing for me as well. Like, it's hard to keep a positive outlook on things just because I see, and it could just be like this echo chamber that, not necessarily that I'm in, but that I explore, where it sounds like nobody's listening to you, and it sounds like scientists are screaming into a void where nobody wants to listen, which I know is obviously not true. There are many people who are listening. There are many eco-friendly companies, and their engineering is really progressing in an environmentally friendly way. There are all these aspects that are good, and we do see numbers in some countries go down in terms of how much pollution they're creating, and so I try to look at those to keep myself up. But then when I hear, politicians like Scott Morrison, the prime minister of Australia, the way that he supports coal industries like nobody's business. Like, Australia is I think it's number 1 in terms of coal production, or at least top 5 for sure.
You gotta keep those lobbyists happy, though, right?
Exactly, because this is how they make their money. Even though Australia would be perfect for solar energy, perfect. Like, it's the best country for it, right? But anyway, so before he got elected, one of the things that he did was in Parliament, he brought a piece of coal to show how it's not dangerous.
Oh, good.
Yep. He said, "Look at this piece of coal. Look, I'm touching it. Look, totally doesn't do anything for me. What are you talking about, climate change? This piece of rock? Come on."
I hate it.
I know. I know.
Like, do you think it's supposed to be like a grenade? Like, we're supposed to all dive under the table, and that's the only way it could be harmful?
Speaker, this is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal. It was dug up by men and women who work and live in the electorates of those who sit opposite. From the Hunter Valley, as the member for Hunter would know. It's coal that has ensured for over 100 years
the Deputy
Australia
Prime Minister
has enjoyed an energy competitive advantage that has delivered prosperity to Australian businesses and has ensured that Australian industry has been able to remain competitive on a global market. Mr. Speaker, those opposite have an ideological, pathological fear of coal. There's no word for coalophobia officially, Mr. Speaker, but that's the malady that afflicts those opposite. But it's that malady, Mr. Speaker, that is afflicting the jobs in the towns and the industries and indeed in this country because of their pathological, ideological opposition to coal being an important part of our sustainable and more certain energy future.
But he's preaching to his choir. And to them, they're like, oh yeah, he's already paying us off anyways. He knows we're all part of the coal industry in some sort of way. So yeah, we're going to sit here and laugh and go, oh, Scott, you jokester. When you think about it, the people who are contributing to climate change and who are really pushing for things not to change are our billionaires, are our corporate companies, because they want to continue making money.
Was your wind farm research on the migratory island, was that your interaction with climate change?
No, actually, my initial interaction was, through undergrad, you take multiple different, conservation courses. But for my honors, I actually worked on a few frog species in Eastern Ontario. And one of the projects that I worked on was we looked at frog phenology. And phenology just refers to the life cycle of an animal in accordance with its seasons. So, like birds are, some birds are migratory. They'll return for the breeding season in spring. Right. So it's the same with frogs. They'll go through a life cycle where they'll mate during the springtime. Right. As soon as the snow starts melting in Eastern Ontario is where I did my work. And what we would do is we set up song meters in different marshes. And what we found was that, I believe it was 9 species altogether in Eastern Ontario. And 4 of those species, the males came a month earlier, because males will start arriving as soon as the ice and the snow melts, and they want to establish kind of like a territory, right? And they start singing for the females. The problem is the female phenology isn't caught up with the male phenology, so females don't come until a month later. So there's all these, tiny little, and oh God, Oot, they are just the cutest little frogs. Anyway, so 4 of the species were singing significantly earlier, and these little males are out there singing their little heart out to nothing, which means they get eaten by predators, right? So those little things just spend an entire winter hibernating, and then they come out and they sing their little hearts out for this sexy female. The females aren't even there. And it's devastating, like we're already seeing frogs are in the biggest decline in terms of, like, if we're looking at vertebrate animals, right? Because they have permeable skin, they breathe through their skin, and there's nothing in their skin to protect them. Like our skin is very thick, and we get SPF damage, but we don't breathe through our skin. If it's gross outside, we're not taking that into our bloodstream because our skin is thick enough. But frogs, they breathe through their skin, which means every molecule that's out there is being taken in by these cute little frogs. And everything in the water, like marshes are terrible grounds for pesticide washout and herbicide washout and everything like that. Marshes will soak that up because marshes happen to be ephemeral. So that means they don't last for the whole season. They only last for a specific amount of time, and then they'll dry up kind of closer to summertime or middle of summertime. And not only do these frogs have a short amount of time for breeding because of the marshes that they're in, the males are coming in earlier and singing their little hearts out. And then sometimes, because of unpredictable climate, they'll get frozen to death because the snow, like sometimes we just get snow in April and you're like, what the fuck just happened? So they'll die, except for the wood frogs because they have really great anti-freeze proteins. So the wood frogs can survive, but either way, if there's no female to sing, like, it's just, we're trying to understand why the females aren't coming when the males are coming, like into the marshes. And also we understand why the males are singing earlier, because it's a cue. It's a cue for animals. Like there's specific cues in nature for animals to be like, oh, okay, now is the breeding season. So the males have this cue that when the ice and the snow starts melting, they need to start singing for the females. But the females have a different cue, and we don't understand why their cue is so much later. Like we're not sure exactly what it is that's bringing the females in a month later. What are they working on? Because it's clearly not the male frog calls. So now we're gotten to the point where, now males and females are together. Whatever males are left and didn't get either frozen to death or most likely eaten by predators because of their singing. But now when the females do arrive a month later, the season already started a month ago when the males started singing. Now the females have to release their eggs, and those little tadpoles have to develop ASAP before the hot summer comes and the marsh is no longer there, right? So these tadpoles have to go through their development, and they have cues from the marsh. Like they have cues, but they can like almost identify when the marsh is going to start drying up. So they'll develop ASAP. Well, if they develop as fast as they can, that means those frogs are going to be smaller than the years before, right? Depending on how quick the marsh dried up. Now, this plays into their life history because when females come to mate, they want to mate with that biggest, sexiest male that they can find. And bigger male frogs also sing deeper, like in a deeper register, which the females just go crazy for. But now you've shifted the size of all of these animals to be smaller because the season started later, the marsh dried up. Okay, so now the females are going to start mating with smaller males, and it's just that same cycle over and over again. So these animals are getting smaller, the females, and females are very reluctant to mate with the first male they see, right? Females are very choosy in many animals, and they'll kind of wait out to see where is this sexy male that I'm looking for, right?
Growing babies and producing another life is a big resource draw.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So, if the females are waiting around for the best male, then perhaps when they do mate, it's a little bit later. And so again, we're pushing that and we're changing that life history trait. And so maybe she can only mate one time in the season instead of, say, twice in the season with two different males, introducing more genetic diversity and things like that. So there's all of these different biological factors that are changing because of the climate change that started this ball rolling. What frustrates me a lot is when people talk about the declines, they mostly talk about birds, reptiles, and mammals. They don't actually mention insects. I don't know, about the food chain. And insects are experiencing like an 85 to 90% decline now.
Jesus Christ.
Before we're even discovering them. Like even frogs, like we're frankly like just discovering a few frog species and then bam, they're extinct like the next week.
So on like a biological level, it's like we're building the biodiversity house on a foundation of sand if we're getting rid of the insects.
Exactly. That's the whole problem. Yeah. Even going off of that, how we had those terrible fires in Australia? And people were saying that we lost like millions of animals. Again, only mammals. Like they were talking about like individual numbers in terms of koalas and kangaroos and, I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures, but they are just like atrocious. It's just all these kangaroos stuck in wires trying to run away from these fires. Like, it was awful. It was so disgusting. Oh my God.
Yeah, and it's I mean, I it's heartbreaking because like I feel like we're all the cause of this. Like I know the statistic. 100 corporations have caused 70% of the emissions to go into the air, but I drive a car, I order products off Amazon from China. Like I'm part of this. Like I've contributed. Like when I see suffering of the environment, like I feel like I don't know, I feel like I'm dumping gasoline on the ground myself a little,
So I see what you're saying, and I agree to a point. I think we have been it's been almost hammered into us that it's our fault that climate change is real. And it is, we are contributing to it, but the typical average person is contributing like 0.0001% compared to those companies, including Amazon, including coal companies and oil companies and and so I think that it started a few decades ago that all of this propaganda that all of those companies started coming out with, where it's like, let's blame the layperson, let's blame them, and they'll just completely forget about the fact that we are harming the environment. It started with that awful commercial where they used an Italian man as a native.
Oh yes.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think it's like somebody throws something out of their car, garbage out of their car, and the Italian slash supposed to be Native American like gives one little tear, and it's like stop littering or something like that. And it's just like, yeah, we litter, and yeah, it's a problem, but we're not burning the goddamn Amazon, you know?
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it.
Yeah, like it's what we do is like on the on the micro level, and like 70% of emissions are due to those companies, and like and like I totally get what you're saying, and I think I am like victim of the propaganda somewhat, because like there's a bunch of like, reduce, reuse, recycle, which is general good advice, but like on the consumer level it can't be done. On the industrial societal level we could totally do it. We just don't have the will,
Yes, I agree. And, of course, we can all do our part, like recycling, composting, buying less plastic. But if you and I and, our families and our friends stop buying plastic, the companies will still continue to put vegetables in plastic.
Yep.
So then it's just going to end up in the wasteland. So you and I can cut it down and show the companies that we're not going to buy it, but it's going to take them, maybe even a decade. I think that's a good estimate. That's a positive estimate to assume that it will take them a decade to stop using plastic with vegetables. Like,
I don't know. Like it seems like we built this this machine with a lot of momentum that runs a certain direction, and like we've built it to produce a bunch of waste, and we built it to produce a bunch of emissions as a part of its function, and like it just seems like such drastic things will have to occur to slow the momentum of this machine, or like change its trajectory, because like it seems like fundamental building blocks of it depend on like polluting in order to function.
So I see exactly where you're coming from, and I used to think that as well. But it actually takes, yes, it takes drastic changes, but those changes can be implemented instantaneously, and the rewards will be instantaneous. Like using, environmentally friendly engineering, like solar panels, wind turbines, things like that, is really good for the environment and can replace coal. And I mean, even nuclear energy is better than coal, right? And it is safe. There's this whole stigma against it, with things like Chernobyl or the Japanese disaster with the nuclear plants, but they are so extremely rare. It's just when they do happen, they are extremely devastating. But those those catastrophes happened, like Chernobyl happened, 5 decades? No, not 5 decades ago. That's way too much. But four decades ago, maybe. Like it was right before I was born. So in 1988 or 89, something like that. The Japanese one happened in the early 2000s, I believe. But that it was just a handful, and yes, it was devastating. I'm not saying that it wasn't. It's a huge catastrophe, but they are so rare, and nuclear energy is much better. But I truly think that the majority of people on this earth believe in climate change and want to make changes. It's just we don't have the power and the money that one billionaire does. But if I think it's like all about working together, that maybe something will change. And like you said, are we past this point of no return? Yes and no. So if we continue living as we do, definitely no point of return. Like, I'm sorry, we're fucked. But if we change like now, and I mean like this minute, then we can. There is still yeah, we can't bring back the, icebergs that have melted, but we can just stop polluting what's already been done, and we can plant more trees, and we can, it's just, I think that we can be done. Is there something that can be done? It's just we all have to like almost lobby against the few handful of people that are driving this awful dark cloud over this planet, literally dark cloud over this planet.
Yeah, you know what? We left the stove on. Kitchen's on fire. We can save the rest of the house.
Exactly. Oh, that's a really great way to put it. Exactly. Yeah. Let's work with what we do have. We can't bring back the animals and the plants that have gone extinct because of our doing. But we can keep the ones that we have alive now. Like why give up? Why give up now? There's no point. I never think that there's a point in giving up. Just because you've kind of you feel like things have gone too far. I think that that's a very negative way to look at things.
Well, I truly like. I think you're right in the end. I think sometimes my pessimism gets the best of me, but I do think a lot of people on Earth believe that climate change is happening and want action because of it. And I think that there's enough power and propaganda going around to stop great action from happening. But I think with a little push, maybe we can get there.
Yeah, I agree. And again, yeah, I think it's a very optimistic way to look at it, but I think it's the right way to look at it. There's no point in kind of sitting there and dwelling on the negativity of climate change, and we should always be thinking about it. That's not to say ignore it. We should always be keeping it in the back of our minds and fighting against it. But don't give up is kind of the message here, right?
I like that. I think that's a good note to end off on. Don't give up. Well, thank you very much for bringing some light to this discussion. Sometimes I'm uncomfortable just bringing the layman's view, so I like to make sure I'm not talking out of my ass. So thank you for being the adult in the room for this discussion.
Thank you very much. Although that is quite generous, I think. The imposter syndrome is settling in.
I think we all live through it. But thank you very much. Would you like to pitch your podcast?
Yeah, for sure. So thanks, Sood, for having me on the podcast. My name is Anastasia Shavrova. You can check out my website at ashavrova.com, as well as the scientific podcast that I co-host called Boiling Point. And very recently, we had Oud on there talking about creationism versus evolution. And yeah, we cover a lot of different topics, such as like aphantasia or different research, like different marine research and other very cool, interesting stuff. Yeah, that's Boiling Point. If you want to look it up anywhere on Spotify, iTunes, or pretty much anywhere you get your podcast.
Well, thank you very much, and you have a wonderful night.
Thank you. You too. You mean morning.
Oh,
remember,
yes.
I'm a whole day in the future.
Right. I will get used to that. I actually do the cliche thing and hang some The entire Earth is a toilet, and if you shit and don't flush, that affects us all.
Yeah.
Don't shit where you eat.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people shitting where they eat right now.
I mean, unless you're Smashing Pumpkin, and then it's the world is a vampire.
No. Okay. And on that note, for Occulte Veritatis, I'm Oud Gallifrey.
Lady Murray.
Richard Bigley.
The soundboard demon.
I forget who I am.
Donald Kaepernick.
Dom and Lemon.
Love you, bye.
Playing us out once again, this episode, our very own Leon Filger with his cover of Rattlin' Bog.
Oh, row the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley, oh, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley, oh, well, in that bog there was a hole, a rare hole, a rattling hole in the bog down in the valley, oh, row the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley, oh, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley, oh, well, in that hole there was a tree, rare tree, a rattling tree, tree in the hole in the bog down in the valley, oh, row the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley, oh, valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o. On that tree there was a branch, a rare branch, a rattling branch, branch in the tree, in the tree, in the hole, in the hole, in the bog down in the valley-o. Ho, row, the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o. On that branch there was a twig, a rare twig, a rattling twig, twig in the branch, in the branch, in the tree, in the tree, in the hole, in the hole, in the bog down in the valley-o. Ho, row, the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o. On that twig there was a nest, a rare nest, a rattling nest, nest on the twig, in the branch, in the branch, in the tree, in the tree, in the hole, in the hole, in the bog down in the valley-o. Ho, row, the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o. On that nest there was a bird, a rare bird, a rattling bird, bird in the nest, in the twig, in the twig, in the branch, in the tree, in the tree, in the hole, in the hole, in the bog down in the valley-o. Ho, row, the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o. In that bird there was an egg, a rare egg, a rattling egg, egg in the bird, in the nest, in the twig, in the twig, in the branch, in the tree, in the hole, in the hole, in the bog down in the valley-o. Ho, row, the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o. Well, that egg there was a chicken, rare chick, a rattling chick, chick in the egg, in the bird, in the nest, and twig, in the branch, in the tree, in the hole, in the bog down in the valley-o. Ho, row, the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o. On that chick there was a feather, a rare feather, a rattling feather, feather in the chick, in the egg, in the bird, in the nest, and twig, in the branch, in the tree, in the hole, in the bog down in the valley-o. Ho, row, the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o. Ho, row, the rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o, real bog, a rattling bog, the bog down in the valley-o.
I hope Leon's folk song calmed you just as it calmed me listening to him record it. But for now, we have some new cult members to welcome into the cult of Valhalla. First, pledging $1 a month, we have Bones. Make no bone about it, with a name like that, I think you'll fit into the cult just fine. Welcome, and may Val bless you. One of our annual patrons upped his pledge. That's right, on Patreon, you now have the option to pay once a year for a year full of access to our Patreon. That's voting for new episodes, getting episodes earlier, and getting access to all our bonus content. So Jared Benson, thank you for upping your pledge. You're keeping the lights on around here. And the last name I'll read out today, Andrea Folster. Welcome to the cult of Valhalla. Thank you for putting your money where your mouth is, keeping the lights on, and supporting independent media. Enjoy all the perks that you have access to at this level. That's it for climate change. We'll be back next week with some more bullshit. Have a wonderful week. Buy some thick socks, because cold times are a-coming.